You can see my screen. I need to declare a few conflicts of interest. I do work with companies that are in the business of trying to make psychedelics therapy, and you can see them listed there. So I'm going to talk about psychedelics that work on the serotonin system, and many of these are shown on this image here. So you have mescaline from the peyote cactus, you have psilocybin from over 200 species of magic mushrooms, you have ayahuasca, which is a brew containing 2 herbs that allow you to drink DMT. You have Amanita muscaris, which is the Northern European mushroom, which is not a serotonergic psychedelic, and I won't talk more about that. And then you have morning glory and many other plants and also fungi like ergot, which make lysergamides. And this is an image from a great vase. It's 3,000 years old, and it shows the Greek god Demeter partaking of ergot and alcohol. And that combination of the psychedelic lysergamides plus alcohol was used in parts of the Greek celebrations called the Eleusinian Mysteries. And these were celebrations of music and dance and theater that underpinned a lot of the creativity, which was very characteristic of ancient Greece and probably contributed to the cultural developments there, such as philosophy, logic, geometry, and also democracy. And so you can make a case that most of the underpinning principles of Western civilization may have been invented or seen during psychedelic experiences. And you could also make very similar arguments for other cultures like Hinduism with the use of similar drugs. But moving fast forward to the last century, to the beginning of the general understanding of psychedelics, and that came from this famous book, Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception. So he took mescaline and from peyote, and it changed his mind very dramatically about both his mind and drugs. And the title of his book, The Doors of Perception, is a quote from the writings of William Blake. William Blake was a very famous British painter and writer. And he said this: if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. And Huxley called the books The Doors of Perception because he saw or understood that mescaline had opened up his doors of perception. And then he made the very sensible conclusion that if mescaline opened up the doors of perception, something must have closed them. And he said this: it was the brain. The brain is an instrument for focusing the mind. And he kind of realized that what mescaline had done was actually switch off the control of his mind and allow his mind to run free. And as I'll show you, that's exactly what these drugs do. But at the same time as Huxley was getting into psychedelics, a new psychedelic was coming along called LSD. And this is a derivative of the lysergamides, which come out of ergot. And it's a more potent version of them, and it's was invented by this man, Albert Hofmann. And he wrote about his experiences very vividly, and he persuaded his company, Sandow, to make it available for use by scientists and psychiatrists in the Western world. And here he is, 100 years of age, overlooking Lake Geneva in his, I think, color-coded villa. And he used psychedelic, LSD mostly, on what we would call a MIDI dose basis for many years. And maybe that's why he lived so long. And Joe Elkes, the first British psychiatrist to try LSD in 1953, he lived to 103. And by the way, Elkes was, I think he was actually Lithuanian, so he comes from the same part of the world as you guys. Now, because of the remarkable impact that LSD and subsequently psilocybin had on people's consciousness, and because at that time in the 50s we had no tools to understand the brain, psychedelics became widely taken up as research tools by psychiatrists. And the United States Institute of Health, NIH, funded about 140 grants to study particularly LSD in terms of psychiatric disorders. And that led to 1,000 clinical papers, studies on 40,000 patients. There were 40 books published, 6 international conferences. And in 1971, when it all ended as a result of the war on drugs, Masters and Houston put together an analysis, and they came to the conclusion that results with these compounds were overwhelmingly positive, describing safe and effective treatments. And here are just 4 big data sets which were published in some of the top journals at the time, by some of the top psychiatrists at the time. And they show a number of things. Well, they show that large numbers of subjects were tested. And they show that rates of adverse effects like psychosis and suicide were very, very low, almost certainly lower than you would have expected in the untreated population. So we knew, even from the early 60s, that these drugs were both interesting, effective, and safe. And again, another quote that was written after they were banned. Treatment with LSD is not without acute adverse reactions, but given adequate psychiatric supervision and proper conditions for its administration, the incidence of such reactions is not great. And that means that people can have bad trips, they can have challenging trips. In fact, we find in our studies with patients that that's the norm. When people are dealing with disorders like depression or addiction, they often visit places in their past which are very challenging to them. But the psychedelics help them deal with it in a way that they haven't been able to deal with it with other drugs or other forms of therapy. And I want to emphasize this interesting experience that led to the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. So here's Bill Wilson. He was, for 15 years, he'd been a very heavy drinker, what they call a chronic inebriate. And he was going through one of his multiple withdrawals, and he was being given a treatment, experimental treatment at the time, called the belladonna treatment, which is an anticholinergic drug, which causes psychotic experiences and psychedelic type experiences. And he said this, suddenly the room lit up with a great white light. I was caught up in an ecstasy which there are no words to describe. It seemed to me, in my mind's eye, that I was on a mountain and that a wind, not of air, but of spirit was blowing. And then it burst upon me that I was a free man. And after that, he threw off the shackles of his alcoholism and he founded Alcoholics Anonymous. And then about 20 years later, LSD became available and he took LSD. And he realized that LSD was an even better way of throwing off the shackles than the scopolamine he'd had before. And he began to argue that LSD could help what he called cynical alcoholics, alcoholics who didn't believe there could be anything that could be more powerful to them than alcohol, overcome their cynicism about change. And he supported the National Institutes of Health in America doing 6 trials of alcoholism, giving 1 or 2 doses of LSD. And a few years ago, 10 years ago now, these 2 Norwegians went back and they got the source data and they did a meta-analysis on it. And this is the data here. And the line in the middle means no effect. And you see this diamond here is about 1 standard deviation away from the line. And that is a very powerful effect size, much bigger than any current therapies we have for alcoholism. And probably 2 or 3 times the best alternative we have today. But as I've already intimated, LSD and other psychedelics have been banned since 1971. And you can do a very simple estimate. Probably 100 million excess deaths in the world from alcohol dependence in that period of 50, it's coming up to 58 years. And if LSD had successfully treated just 10% of those, you probably saved about 10 million premature deaths. And how many lives have been saved by the ban of LSD? Well, probably none, because it's not clear that recreational use has changed. But even if you say 1,000, maybe say 1 million, it doesn't really matter, because the benefit ratio is so much in favor of the benefits of LSD that it's actually completely immoral that we have not allowed access of this treatment to people with this life-terminating disorder. And actually, there aren't many medicines in medicine that have a ratio of comparative benefit over risk of as much as psychedelics. And there was also interest in using them for other addictions. And this is the one study I know of in heroin addiction. And here people were given an LSD trip as part of their abstinence-based therapy. So the two groups were treated similarly, but this group were given one LSD trip here. And you can see that after over 12 months, by the end of 12 months, about 25% were abstinent. Now that's amazing. The group that weren't given LSD, most relapsed. And I can say I've been working in the field of heroin addiction for the last 30 years. And without therapy, none of our patients maintain abstinence at 3 months. So this is really a rather remarkable outcome, which is very suggestive that a psychedelic experience could be therapeutic, and it needs to be replicated. And I can say we're setting out now to do a psilocybin replication study of this. But I want to give you this quote from one of the patients, Leonard. He said, "The two experiences of heroin and LSD are like night and day. Heroin is night, a time to sleep, and with sleep, nothing comes. But with LSD, it's like dawn, a new awakening. It expands your mind. It gives you a brand new outlook on life." So this is what happened. What happened was that in 1967 and then subsequently in 1971, the US and the UN banned these drugs. And the reason they banned these drugs because they were being associated with the anti-Vietnam War movement. And actually this image, this photograph here, is the real reason these drugs got banned, because the American government couldn't ban anti-war protests, but they could ban the LSD that they thought were fueling and supporting and encouraging the anti-war protesters. Now, the war ended within a decade of that, but they've never rescinded the ban on psychedelics. And they banned LSD and they banned all other psychedelics with a similar serotonergic activity at the same time. And you see the impact of this is really dramatic. So here you see the number of papers per year published with LSD. And then here in pink, the number of papers per year published on psilocybin. And massive increase in outputs because of this enormous investment by the US National Institutes of Health. And then a precipitate fall off. And here, for 2 years in the 1990s, there were not a single paper published on psilocybin. And that was a deliberate policy to try to eliminate all knowledge of these drugs. And it was peculiar because all these papers said these drugs have medical value. But the ban put them in LSD and psilocybin into Schedule 1, which says no medical value, and they're highly dangerous and they're addictive. And that led to this cataclysmic fall-off in research. And there were two reasons for that. The first is that the US government stopped funding any research, and they were the biggest funders, and so did all the other governments that signed up to this UN conventions. In fact, at the time, the only country that didn't sign up was actually North Korea. And the second reason for the collapse is that if you could get funding, for instance, from a philanthropist to work with these drugs, it was almost impossible to get hold of the drugs because the regulations were so stringent. And it's only in the last 8 or 10 years that the situation has been rectified. And I'll show you about some of the research which has actually happened in that period. But I want to emphasize one thing. This is the worst censorship of any research in the history of the world. And it has led to, as I've suggested, millions of premature deaths because treatments which were of proven efficacy here were denied as a result of a political policy to try to stop people protesting the war in Vietnam. And what was remarkable was that the ban occurred in the face of opposition from the most powerful man in America at the time, who would have been president, Bobby Kennedy, if he hadn't been assassinated. And he's saying this to his bureaucrats. He's saying, why, if these LSD projects were worthwhile 6 months ago, we've spent billions of dollars on them, why aren't they worthwhile now? We keep on going around and around. If I could get a flat answer about that, I'd be happy. Is there a misunderstanding about my question? And he knew he was being lied to, but he couldn't stop it. You know, he was able to stop the war with Russia over the Cuban Missile Crisis, but he couldn't stop the anti-drug bans. And that's been a huge problem because the bureaucracy of banning drugs has absolutely dominated the field. And it's the worst censorship in the history of science, in the history of the world. I want to say a little bit about MDMA because that's also become very relevant in recent years. And if we were talking about MDMA 20 years ago, we'd be talking about it causing brain damage. And in fact, we now know that the evidence of it causing brain damage was a fabrication created by some American scientists and lobbyists to justify the ban of MDMA. And now we realize that MDMA actually can have a very healing effect on the brain. And the reason for that is war. And the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the wars in Syria leading to trauma in civilians. I mean that PTSD is now one of the, maybe the third disorder of the current century. And you have this bizarre situation now where more American and Australian soldiers kill themselves than are killed by the enemy. So war has become an internalized, self-destructive phenomenon. And that's because so many of them end up with PTSD because they get traumatized, they get blown up by an enemy they never see, and they obviously don't understand the point of what they're doing. Now, what I'm going to talk you through now are the three major pieces of data that I presented to the Australian drug regulators last November to argue that they should change the laws on psilocybin and MDMA in order to make these drugs available for patients who needed them. And there were really three arguments that I made. And the first is about the myth of harm. And what you see here are three graphs. And there are three graphs from experts from the UK, the European Union, and Australia, completely different sets of experts. They all use the same technique. They all use the technique called multi-criteria decision analysis. It's a technique which is the most sophisticated way of assessing drug harms there is. And it gives you a scale, a score of harms. In the case here, the blue bar is the harms to the user, and the red bar of harms to society, and the same with these both. And they all show two things. They all show there's a ranking order is identical, pretty much, and they all show that alcohol is the most harmful drug in these different jurisdictions. But they all show in the red circles that LSD, magic mushrooms, MDMA are amongst the least harmful drugs of all the drugs which are used recreationally. And they're even less harmful when they're used clinically. So this argument that these drugs were too dangerous to be made available as medicines is completely false. What about the latest scientific data? Well, when we're talking about serotonergic psychedelics, we're talking about these drugs I've mentioned already, and they all bind to the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor. And their affinity at the receptor determines their dosing. This is potency. LSD, very high affinity, very potent. Mescaline, low affinity, not so potent. Maybe 100 micrograms of LSD, you might need, for mescaline, you would you'd use maybe 1,000 milligrams. It might be 10,000 times greater efficacy here than here in terms of affinity. And the affinity at the receptor determining the potency, that tells us that these drugs all work through the 2A receptor. And we can, if we block the 2A receptor, these drugs don't work. And these 2A receptors are very interesting because they are enormously highly expressed in the most recently evolved parts of the human brain. And these are the parts of the brain where we do our thinking, our feeling, our imagining, our planning. And they're not so much in the sensory motor cortex, and they're not so much in the visual cortex, and there's very low levels of them in the midbrain and brainstem. And this low density in areas of the brain which control vital functions like breathing and heart rate explains why these drugs are very safe. They change your mind, but they don't change the physiology of your body. And the human brain has more of these receptors than any other brain. And we don't exactly know why that is, but we're pretty sure they're involved in some of the most high level cognitive processes which define what humans are and what humans can achieve. And the 2A receptors have a particularly interesting location. And I'll just explain a little bit about this because it makes sense of what they do. Your brain is a three-dimensional computer. The first dimensions of computation are along this axis here, which is an axis we call cortical columns. If you look at the cortex is made up of billions of these columns, and each column is a little computer. And then the connections across all the columns are made by these, what we call layer 5 pyramidal cells. They integrate all the computing of all these individual columns, and that's why your brain is more powerful than all the computers on Earth today, because it's like having 40 or 50 billion computers all lined up working together. And the connections to these layer 5 pyramidal cells make the brain work as an integrated whole. But for reasons we don't understand, these neurons are laden with these 5-HT2A receptors. And if you stimulate them with a psychedelic, these cells depolarize dramatically. And that disrupts their processing. And that's why you get the psychedelic state, because psychedelics disrupt the efficiency of the brain in controlling and regulating the mind. And this is what Huxley said. So what our neuroscience studies now show us that he was right. Psychedelics lower the efficiency of the brain as an instrument for focusing the mind. So let me just give you an example of this using vision as the example. So your brain is not a camera. You do not take pictures of the outside world. If you did that, you'd fill up your memory banks before you were one. What happens is it lights photons from the outside images come into the retina. They're turned into electrical impulses. Those impulses go up into different parts of the cortex, and they're integrated into an estimate of what's out there. So your brain constructs an image from electrical impulses. But at the same time, the frontal parts of your brain over here are making a prediction as what's out there. And that's called a prior. So everything you look at, your front of your brain is saying, what could it be? It's making the best estimate. And then it's checking that estimate with the sensory input it gets from the retina. And those two things come together and the brain then decides what you've got. Now, when you disrupt these layer 5 pyramidal cells in the cortex, it makes it hard to make priors, and it makes it hard to integrate all these different visual sensory inputs. And so you see these very elemental hallucinations. Now, what's interesting about these is that physiologists for the last 50 years, working with electrical recordings of the visual cortex, have come to the conclusion that these are the building blocks, these are the basic perceptual inputs on which you build your bigger, more complicated visual images. So in fact, under psychedelics, you are seeing, for the first time since you were a child, a baby, the primary workings of the visual cortex. And that in itself, I think, is one of the most remarkable outputs of the research for these drugs. But of course, there's enormous amount of clinical data. And that's the reason why the Australians and hopefully soon the Americans will make these drugs legal. And here are 3 trials in depression. Here's the trial we conducted back 2012 to 2014. people with treatment-resistant depression, they were all failed on at least 2 antidepressants. Some had failed on more than 10. They'd all failed on CBT. And look, they all got better after a single trip with psilocybin. And some of them went into remission inside the yellow bar, and some have stayed in remission ever since. The vast majority, the depression's crept back. But still, that impact of that one treatment over months is the most powerful treatment of single-dose treatment for resistant depression there's ever been. And that's been replicated over here. This is the Compass Pathways recent study where they said exactly the same dose as us, 25 milligrams, and got almost the same results. But this is a really important study because it was a multi-site study in many countries using people with different languages. And it also used lower dose, a 10 milligram dose, and a 1 milligram dose. So this is a dose response effect, and it shows the trip dose is what gives the good outcome. And in the middle, you have a study from Johns Hopkins where they took people with depression, not necessarily resistant depression, and they treated people immediately either with psilocybin, which got them better, or they kept them on a waiting list, and they didn't get better. And then at this point, they gave these people psilocybin, and they did get better. And there are also studies of ayahuasca and intravenous DMT for depression as well. So now a lot of evidence we can help people, particularly with treatment-resistant depression. And Nathan has already mentioned this. He's already mentioned this famous study now by Matt Johnson of using a couple of psychedelic psilocybin trips in people who were trying to stop smoking. And here, what you see here is of the 15 people, 12 of them stopped smoking completely, and 3 carried on. And this is the most powerful outcome of tobacco quitting has ever been. And Matt has gone on subsequently to replicate this using a single dose of psilocybin versus a nicotine patch. And he's shown that 59% of the psilocybin group stopped smoking versus 28% of the patch. On the right-hand side here, you see a very recent study by Michael Bogenschutz in alcohol use disorder. And here, this is a controlled trial, which is randomized between psilocybin or an active control called diphenhydramine, a sedative drug. And you see here, the blue bars show that very significant benefits in terms of reducing drinking over many, many weeks of psilocybin, just 2 doses of psilocybin compared with the active placebo. And this is going to be moved on now into a phase 3 trial. So we've got safety, we've got new evidence of efficacy, and we now know how they work. And we know how they work at the level of the brain. So these are a series of studies using a range of different drugs along these top here, and using a technique called magnetoencephalography, MEG. And it shows what I call brain prints. And you can see there are very big differences between different drugs. On the right-hand side here, in the red rectangle, we have psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, ketamine. And blue in these images means there's reduced power, there's reduced amount of activity in these different frequency bands. So these are the frequency bands of the electrical activity of the brain. And all psychedelics desynchronize the brain. They reduce the power in these frequencies particularly. And that's what we call the entropic brain. The brain becomes very, very disorganized. You break down the routine processes. These are other drugs. Here are GABA drugs, like anesthetics. They do the opposite. They hypersynchronize the brain. They lock the brain into processes from which it can be hard to escape, particularly if you've got this drug, propofol, when you're anesthetized. And here's alcohol, which is more of a GABA drug than it is a psychedelic. So sedatives synchronize, psychedelics desynchronize. And that's the fundamental explanation as to why they produce changes in the brain. Now, one of the areas of the brain that they disrupt is this area, or this network called the default mode network. And it's a network of the brain that consists of these frontal region here, this posterior region here, and these 2 lateral parietal regions. So this is a top-down view of the brain. Here's a side-on view. And this network of the brain is called the default mode network, and it's the network of the brain in which you do all your self-referential thinking. It's where you think about yourself, your past successes, your past failures, your future plans, etc. Under psychedelics, the default mode is completely fragmented. It doesn't work. It doesn't work as a network. And that's why people have very strange experiences. Some people feel they've been atomized, they floated out of the scanner, and that they're no longer a single entity, because default mode is in which the area, the network in which you code that sense of bodily self as well as mental self. Why is that important? Well, it turns out that about the same time as we were doing this work, our imaging work, this group at Yale was showing that in depressed people, people with major depressive disorder, the default mode network is over-connected. More of the brain is engaged in this self-referential thinking compared with controls. And that over-connectivity in depression relates to rumination, to the processes of repetitive thought loops, which are destructive and maladaptive and actually wrong, but which patients struggle to escape from. So we thought if we can disrupt the default mode with psychedelics, maybe we could disrupt it in people with depression. And that's why we did the depression study, and that's why it worked. And this is an example of translational medicine. I didn't start off expecting to use psychedelics to treat depression, but I moved to doing that because the brain imaging studies suggested it could be useful, and it turns out it is. And one of the other interesting outputs of the brain imaging is this image here. And these two images contain the same number of connections, 7,200 connections. But you see on the left-hand side, under placebo, most of the connections are around the edge of the brain. And that's called the small world brain network. And that tells us that the auditory cortex talks to the auditory cortex, the visual cortex to the visual cortex. Of course, if you see a lorry bearing down on you, you've got to move your legs. So you've got to go from the visual cortex to the motor cortex to make things happen. But the brain is very efficient because it does most of its communicating around the edge. But that efficiency comes at a cost. If you lock into this peripheral processing negative thoughts or obsessional thoughts or addictive thoughts, it can be very hard to disrupt them because they carry on having a life of their own. But under psychedelics, connectivity is massively increased. You break down the barrier, the default mode, which constrains these thinking processes, is broken down. And so connections are made which you weren't allowed to make, or haven't been allowed to make since you were a child. And this increase in connectivity has a huge impact in terms of patient welfare, because during the trip, that connectivity allows people to see what happened to them, to see and go back to places they've been repressing, to experience behaviors and interactions which they can reevaluate. And they can come up with what we call new solutions to old problems. They can reframe their problems in the past and come up with new ways of thinking about them. And I'll give you an example. One of our patients with chronic depression, he saw his father abusing him during his trip. And he realized that was his problem. That's why he was depressed. And up to that point, he blamed himself. But he reframed it during the trip and realized it was his father's fault. But more than that, he could get closure. He could see his father as a pathetic man, and he could just say, that's it. I'm out of this, Father. And since then, he's actually been well. He's managed to, in a way, terminate the ongoing memory that was causing his depression. And more recently, we've discovered that with brain imaging, we can actually see long-lasting changes in the brain as a result of psychedelics, which makes sense of the subjective experiences, the clinical benefits. I've illustrated here with these graphs. The paper is published here, and what we did was we measured the flexibility of the brain, the ability of the brain to move between different states in depression, under psilocybin, and after psilocybin. And in depression, it's very difficult for people to think differently. They get locked in to ways of thinking which they often know are wrong, but they can't escape from. And that's because the energy landscape of the brain is very steep. People get locked into a valley where their thoughts are very negative, and they cannot think differently. They just cannot escape those thoughts. Under psychedelics, the energy landscape gets flattened. That's that entropic brain I showed you before. Now, we don't scan our patients while they're having the trip, because that would be challenging, and it might also interrupt their therapeutic value of the trip. But we do scan them either a day later or 3 weeks later. And we see that the energy landscape is still flatter than it was before. And this flattening of the landscape allows them to think more clearly, to be more flexible. And they often talk about it. They often talk about the experiences as being one like you defrag the hard drive of your computer, or you run an antivirus program. You can think more clearly. You're not locked into these maladaptive loops. So for the first time, we're able to image the brains of people who've had a psychedelic treatment and show that the more flexibility after the treatment, the better their outcome. We are producing a change in the brain which accords very well with their subjective experience. And here's an example from one of the two studies. So this image here shows what we call modularity, how locked into different modes of activity the brain is. And after psilocybin, that modularity breaks down. The brain networks become more connected. And that increased connectivity predicts outcome at 6 months. So you can change the brain and it predicts outcome. Now, what's interesting, and in the second study we did a comparison of psilocybin, 2 doses of psilocybin, and the standard antidepressant escitalopram, SSRI. And we know that escitalopram doesn't increase flexibility. And we've known in many other people's work that what antidepressants do is blunt emotional responding. They dampen down the stress circuit in the brain. And these drugs are a bit like a plaster of Paris to a broken limb. The plaster doesn't heal the bone, but it protects the bone so the bone can heal itself. And what antidepressants do is they dampen down the emotional centers of the brain, which are hyperstimulated in depression, and they allow the brain to heal over a period of weeks or months from the chronic stress which leads to depression. But the problem is that dampening down the emotion centers might dampen down your response to stress, but it also dampens down your response to happiness. And people on SSRI sometimes complain of having blunted emotions. They're not as depressed as they were before, but they're not as happy as well. And these are fundamentally different ways of changing depression. Now, what about addiction? What's going on in addiction with psychedelics? Well, I have a slightly different theory. In addiction, we tend to utilize this concept which has been developed by Nora Volkoff over many years, that there are 4 brain regions which drive depression: the emotional circuit, the motive circuit, the control circuit of the prefrontal cortex, and the orbitofrontal cortex, which integrates, drives, and decisions, and to determine whether you actually go and take a drug or not. And in addiction, what we find is that the overarching control from the prefrontal cortex, which is like the superego in Freudian terms, becomes attenuated. And the drive to take drugs becomes accentuated, either because of more drive, craving, or more stress. What psychedelics do, and we're talking about both ketamine and psilocybin here, and MDMA in this network, what these drugs do is break these pathways. So the psychedelics disrupt the cortical pathways and allow the prefrontal cortex to recover and control the orbitofrontal cortex. And MDMA, when it's used for PTSD, and also, as we've shown, for alcohol addiction, that breaks the pathway from the stress circuit to the motive circuit, so stops people trying to overcome stress by taking drugs. And on top of all that, we have this new phenomenon of neuroplasticity, that psychedelics and MDMA improve or accelerate the growth of synapses in the brain. And this can be really important in allowing people to lay down long-standing, enduring new learnings about why they're an addict and how to deal with addiction and the motives to take drugs in the future. And I just want to emphasize, on top of all this, we use therapy. The change brain state you get with psychedelics and MDMA makes psychotherapy more effective. And I'll finish now with another quote from another philosopher and playwright, this man, George Bernard Shaw. Those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. And psychedelic treatments have changed the minds of our patients through changing their brains. And what we need to do now is change the minds of healthcare professionals. I don't think that'll be difficult because they're normally open-minded. We've got to change the minds of politicians and regulators. And we've got to bring them back into medical practice, which of course is why you've invited me to give this talk today. And I just want to emphasize again, Australia has changed its mind. It's changed its mind on the basis that there are hundreds of people in Australia every year committing suicide for untreated depression and untreated PTSD. And they think that the evidence that I've shown you today is good enough to make these drugs, psilocybin and MDMA, available for those patients for whom other treatments have failed. And in America, we have this remarkable phenomenon of the mushrooms marching on the Capitol building. And the only thing this building agrees on across the Democrat-Republican divide is that mushrooms are the future. And President Biden is very optimistic that they will be therapy, along with MDMA therapy, in a couple of years. And if Latvia wants to be the first country in Europe to legalize them, well, good for you, and I'll very much support you doing that. So I'm going to stop. If you want to read more about the medical value of these drugs, there's a book just recently published by me and David Castle. And in next month, my new book on psychedelics will come out. I hope you'll read that as well. So thank you, and I'll take questions.
Yes, we have one question. It is, in 2003, scientists showed a rapid change in gene expression after injecting rats with LSD. An animal study in 2020 found that a single dose of psychedelic psilocybin altered the expression of 19 genes in the prefrontal cortex, especially those related to the immune system. A subsequent animal study found similar brain effects on genes related to neuroplasticity. Finally, a very recent preprint study suggests possible effects on thousands of genes after DMT. And the question is, isn't it dangerous for genes, for the next generations? There is no long-term catamnesis? That's a question for you. What do you think?
Well, that conversation that you just had with me has changed genes in my brain and your brain. If you don't change genes, you don't learn anything. So changing genes is really a vital part of everything we do. But what these drugs don't do, they don't change genes in the germlines. They don't change genes in your eggs or your sperm. They just change genes in your brain because your brain works differently, and it's not surprising. Stress changes. Everything you do changes genes in your brain. What's interesting about psychedelics is they change genes which increase neuroplasticity, which, as I said, has real advantages in terms of coming to terms with or establishing and laying down new ways of thinking. But of course, they also change genes which might be related to inflammation and the immune system, as you mentioned, and that may be good for reducing inflammatory disorders like even Alzheimer's. There's also a really interesting body of work just starting using psychedelics at sub-psychedelic doses to treat disorders like stroke, where in animal models you can show that psychedelics can enhance regrowth of neurons after stroke. So there are many neurological as well as psychiatric disorders where those gene changes will end up being therapeutic.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. We have some more questions, but we have to move on.